So now in our progress, we've reached the year 1600 and the birth of modern science. Modern science, 17th century, 1600s, all different than science had ever been before. Why? First of all, because scientists in the 17th century now began to develop the tools they would need to be precise. So two good examples: Galileo invents the telescope, and a Dutch researcher invents the microscope in the Netherlands. So those two scopes allow researchers to work with faraway heavens and close bugs, bacteria. Both of those studies are revolutionized in the 17th century. But it's a whole new attitude toward science. Science in the 17th century is discovered to be a observational act. You look at nature and you record your observations, you record the time of day, you record the time of light, you record all these things, and you bring together your information, and then you test it, and then you do it again, and you keep records, and then you publish your results in the now printed journals that were able to appear all over Europe in the 17th century. Printing has been around 200 years, now it's better, and so the scientific community is suddenly universal. It is all linked together by printed journals and articles, and therefore science progresses. Doesn't matter where you live, doesn't matter what language you use, doesn't matter where you wrote your article. It will be accessible in Budapest, and it will be accessible in Athens and London, and that's the birth of modern science. Here are just some of the key dates. Copernicus, you know, the middle of the 1500s. He writes his book with his theory, but it's not widely read or widely known. He dies at the very same time that it is published, so therefore he doesn't get to lecture about it or spread it. So it really goes dormant for 50 years. It's Galileo that brings it all back. Vesalius, a whole introduction to the anatomy of the human body, which then supplants the Greek Galen. 1589, Galileo on fallen bodies. Gilbert on magnetism in the earth. Kepler, planetary motion. His observations will provide Galileo with massive amount of information. 1610, probably the most important publication in all of this, Galileo's Starry Messenger, which we'll talk about next week, 1610. Francis Bacon in England, a whole new book on scientific method. William Harvey, 1628, on the circulation of blood and the heart. First time that anyone has correctly laid out relationship between heart, blood. Descartes, 1637. Royal Society, we're going to get there, 1662. Robert Boyle, 61. Von Leeuwenhoek, the microscope and all the little things that the microscope discovered. And then Isaac Newton finally at the end of the century. The key to all of this in the 17th century will be freedom of thought, governments not interfering, allowing people to pursue their various research. And of course, Galileo is the most famous example of someone not having freedom of thought. His work shows basically the impossibility of shutting down the scientific research, but they did stop him from publishing in Italy, and so in a sense they slow him down. In England, it's the reverse. In England, although King James and King Charles in the 1600s have trouble with their parliaments, and eventually Charles ends up in a civil war, all of which is his own fault. The Civil War lasts from 1640 to 1650, and then from 1650 to 1660, England has a republic. Charles is executed in 1649. The Parliament takes over. One of the leaders of this group is John Milton, and just so we understand what the position is of the revolutionaries in England, you can turn to one of the greatest books ever written by anybody, ever. The title of it is Areopagitica, which is taken from Greece and from Demosthenes. He also gave a speech in the Areopagus. That is a place in the middle of Athens where you made public speeches, and his speeches were named after it, and then Milton is imitating that. 1644, and in his book, and we in 2020 should remember this book, he embraces total freedom of speech and freedom of print. Complete and total freedom of speech and freedom of print. This is John Milton, Puritan leader of the Republic, a democracy, Democrat, little d. Here's his book, Areopagitica, a speech of John Milton's, where he states unequivocally absolute freedom of speech and freedom of print, and that is going to be the position of the English government in the latter part of the 17th century. So in other words, freedom of research, freedom of print, and freedom of speech are the absolute necessity of scientific progress. It cannot take place in any society where the government interferes with freedom of speech. There are no examples of successful scientific programs under dictatorships. We can just look at Stalin's Soviet Union as a good example of what happened to Soviet science in the 30s and then even in the 50s after the war. So the Milton position of the Puritan civilian Republican government of the 1650s, that is Cromwell, is total freedom of speech and freedom of print. Now, let me point out that Milton gets a lot of arguments from his fellow Puritan leaders. So it isn't like his position is just automatically accepted by everybody. But that was the position of his leadership group. That same position will be carried in the United States of America. That position will be incorporated into the American government and the Bill of Rights. So it isn't like it disappears. They will have to fight for it in England, but in the United States, it will be absolute. In 1660, as most of you know, the Cromwellian regime collapses after 10 years for lots of different reasons. One is there's absolutely no way for succession. There's no way for them to decide who's going to succeed Cromwell. Nobody wants his son. So what do? Well, they asked the Stuart family, do you have a king? And yes, they did. They had Charles II. How about having him come back? And Charles said, love it. Love to come back. I'm living over here in exile in France, and I hate it. I want to come back. And so England said, okay, come back. So he did. So you get the Restoration, 1660, and the most important thing about Charles are his doggies. That is the one most important thing. Right, Patty Fredlund? The doggies. So we'll move on from the doggies and talk about King Charles. And what does King Charles do? Well, one of the very first things he does, he's very well read, very well informed. He'd been living in France for 10 years, and he knew a lot about science. He was very interested in it. I don't mean as a novice, but as someone who really read everything and knew what was going on in Europe. So he chooses in November 1660, only months after he's come back, to set up and grant to a new association a royal charter from the king to establish a Royal Society for Scientific Research. The Royal Society, there's its building. In the 18th century, there's some rooms inside, libraries, of course. What was the Royal Society going to be? Number one, the Royal Society would have members. Number two, meetings. Meetings in London, meetings in the Royal Society headquarters buildings, meetings in these beautiful classical buildings with these beautiful classical columns, the Corinthian columns and the Doric columns and the Ironic columns. And they would deliver papers. There would be papers delivered at the Royal Society meetings, and these papers would then have comment. There would be a paper delivered, and then there would be a commentary period, and then they would publish the text of the meeting, the paper, the peer review, the commentary. If you publish the paper, you publish a peer review commentary, maybe 3, 4, 5 other commentary papers. Please take note. This is exactly the way every single academic society proceeds. Every single one. Number 4, publications. The most important thing they were going to do is set up a procedure for publications of the Royal Society, so they opened up the Journal of the Royal Society, or Transactions of the Royal Society. That academic journal is the first scientific journal in the world. It is still in existence. You can go right into the Stanford Library and pick up the latest issue of Transactions of the Royal Society. All meetings, journals, and publications would be open to the entire world. All they had to do was send in a paper in English. Well, what's the situation right now? The same, exactly the same. Every academic society in the world prints publications, submits publications to other journals, comments on other publications, and they all do it in English. The underlying necessity for all this, what? Freedom of the press and freedom of debate. So Charles was going to preside over exactly what John Milton asked for, and it was going to proceed for the next 20 years. Members, meetings, papers, peer review, publications, a journal, Transactions of the Royal Society. You've created now, for the first time ever, a new international language conversation in English, still true, still going on. All of this leads to Isaac Newton and to the completion of a mathematical model of the world in the publications of Isaac Newton. And therefore, all aspects of the universe were going to be clarified in his great publication, Principia, in 1687, printed, of course, in London. So, 1660, Royal Society, parliamentary free political society, sponsors of successful scientific research. All of this flourishes only in a completely free society that gives free speech and free press, which are the two premier countries now at that moment in science, England and the Netherlands. And there will not be any rivalry from any dictatorship. They can try, they do try, but even in Paris, the lack of freedom causes all of the most important scientists to publish in Amsterdam. They just go to Amsterdam, and that's where they publish. That's where Descartes publishes his most important works. So, there you are. There is the whole picture of the birth of modern science. And you know, if we think back, you have to have the Greek foundation, you have the ancient Israelites and their foundation, you have the Middle Ages, bring it together, bring it forward, you have the Renaissance in Italy and the Reformation, Lutheran Germany, to advance freedom of thought, and then all along the development of the clock, the equal hour, and finally in 1600 you saw that one picture with all those names on it. It's all around 1600. Almost all these fields come together at about the same time in 1600.